Hey folks, Malforian here, and today we're covering Tinto Talks 11 for EU5, and this covers levies, mercenaries, and how regular regiments are going to work. Our first real look at how the military is going to function in this game. We are going to get a lot more information about that in the future, but as always, this is going to be our first kind of like brief overview of these systems and what has changed from EU4. And as always, I will do a follow-up video on Friday with all of Johan's replies, where he's already fleshing out some of these systems here and giving us a bit more information, as he always does. But we're just going to get straight into the military organization of armies. And while there are a very large number of different types of units, they all belong to 4 different categories in EU5. This is infantry, cavalry, artillery, and the auxiliary units. But as the same as historically, infantry is going to make up the bulk of most of your armies, and the other 3 categories have specific roles, so cavalry for like fast flanking attacks, artillery for breaking down forts, but also very important in battle, and then auxiliaries are going to be the kind of more supportive units, I would think, that are going to kind of aid the other ones more than being the frontline troops and things like that. The size of each regiment varies over time. The earliest infantry regiments are 100 men, and by the end of the game, they are around 3,200 men in each regiment. Cavalry, artillery, and auxiliary units have different sizes, so they do flex up and down as well, but not in the same kind of regimented way, pardon the pun. In EU5, they also categorize a regiment either as a levy, a mercenary, or a regular regiment. As we do know, the game does span a lot of time. At the beginning of the game, you're going to have a lot more levies. At the end of the game, more kind of regimented armies, professional armies at that point, due to obviously the time difference there and how things changed historically. Any army can freely rearrange these into any stacks they want and split up their regiments as the player sees fit, which is a great change. So if you want to have half a mercenary company in one army and the other in another army, that is perfectly fine in this game. I don't know if that's like a slight dig at other Paradox games, but I do like the fact you can split up your mercenary companies and put them in different armies where you see that you're going to get the most out of it. So that's a cool change. And then we're going to get on to our first screenshot here, and this is going to be for horse archers, which is a subtype of cavalry. It says at the bottom here that this is a unique cavalry unit from the first stage of the game that some cultures have access to. So think of those cultures that were very famous for having horse archers. They're going to have these available. And as you can see, requirements for construction, which is a funny way of saying making horse archers, but I get what they're going for. You need leather, horses, and weaponry. And then requirements for maintenance, which Johan is going to cover later on. You need leather, horses, and weaponry again. And if you don't keep them maintained, there are obviously detrimental effects. And as I said, we'll get onto that shortly. It costs you 1 manpower a month. This is obviously placeholder, I think, but that is, I believe, what that bit means. And then we've got the unit statistics, so very much like EU4, you can see exactly what they do. It also shows your food storage and consumption, so that's going to affect your attrition, depending on how far your campaigns are going to go into areas where you can't keep those stockpiled up. And then you've got movement speed, initiative, flanking ability, a lot of very similar EU4 terms there, but I like how it's kind of laid out. Again, these are all placeholder graphics and things, but it's kind of cool to just see everything in one place and exactly what they're going to do. As it says at the top, maximum strength 100, so again, at the beginning of the game, they're going to be smaller units. And then I guess if you do keep these for some reason, you might be able to increase those into larger and larger regiments in the future. And then the first type of military unit we're going to talk about are, again, the levies. As we said before, these are going to be more important at the beginning of the game. And then as the game progresses, you get more into those regiments and professional armies situation. But with levies, these are where you can raise your able-bodied fighting men into a fighting force. This provides you with a lot of people who can fight for you, but the levies have a few slight drawbacks. First of all, you can only raise them when you are at war or facing rebels, so you can't just have these permanently stationed by the looks of it. Secondly, when you raise your levies, these pops are raised from your general populace. So this represents your population going off to war, and any dead men in a levy are a population permanently lost. So these are your men that are farmers, miners, doing the day-to-day jobs that keep your kind of realm going. And then obviously if they get raised as a levy, they're no longer doing that. They're going to go fight, and that decreases your population when they go and die, unfortunately. And then if they go and die, that's going to lower your population, affect those other things, which they have covered previously. And then speaking of that, levies do not spawn with any experience to speak of. And then also, interestingly, you have no direct control over the type of unit that you get, which is going to be very interesting. I'm guessing they mean you get general regiments, but there's a chance you will randomly get cavalry and not artillery, I wouldn't have thought. That wouldn't really make sense, but I'm not sure 100% what that means about that you have no direct control over the type of units you get, but we'll get a lot more information about that in the future. Let me know what you think down below. The bit about not having experience, again, makes sense. These are levies. These aren't professional soldiers. They're just your general populace being raised up and saying, like, you go fight for the king now. Do as well as you can, chaps, because we haven't trained you at all, really. So good luck. Here's a spear. have a good time. And then he does go on to say another slight drawback is that levies do not reinforce during the campaign either. Okay, that's an interesting change. Does that mean like not at all? Even if you bring them back to your realm, they don't reinforce? That is a very interesting change. That'd be kind of cool one to come to Crusader Kings. Not to divert it onto another game, but I'd actually quite like that in Crusader Kings. It would make war more interesting, where you couldn't just like permanently reinforce, even if you're not in your own lands. And then, as we said, a consequence as well is that a province where levies have been raised will also produce less food and less raw materials because the men are off fighting. They're not doing their day-to-day jobs. You can either raise all your levies or you can raise them from a province individually, which again is pretty cool because you could either raise everyone if you need to, or I guess you can kind of like cherry pick, like, okay, that province is where all my food is getting made, so I'm not going to raise troops from there. It might also be your most populous one, but that could be like a decision that you make. Like, I'm not going to raise them from my mining area because I need that raw materials coming in. So I'll avoid those and raise everyone else. So again, having that control, always good. And then in our next screenshot, we can see the army levies for Sweden, the bulk of them coming from Stockholm. You could raise over 12,000 troops. That's quite a lot, isn't it? And then it does give you the breakdown of the top ones. And then it does say 2,000 are available from 12 other provinces, I guess, just to keep the tooltip down in size. So it's not just a massive, massive list, but again, shows you the more important areas. But that's our first look at levies and how they will work. Nothing too crazy. I think it works pretty much how we thought it would be, but it's interesting about they don't replenish and you have no control over the type of units you get. Like I say, I would imagine most of them are just normal regiments of fighting troops, but we'll see, obviously, a little bit more information in the future. The next kind of unit that we can get, as they already covered, is mercenaries. And there are many mercenary companies available in the world, and each area has a few possible to recruit. However, these are not free endless manpower, as other nations may be recruiting them before you can. So I guess that just means, like, there is a certain amount. Everyone else could hire them first. And then, obviously, when that kind of, like, tour of duty with that realm ends, it's not like they're going to be full of manpower when you take them over. They are going to take time to kind of replenish as well. They're going to follow the same rules as everyone else. So it's not just like kind of like an endless route, as it says, to winning wars by just having these troops. Somebody else could beat you to them. A mercenary company signs up for at least 2 years, but you can extend that if you desire. And there will be more about mercenaries in a future dev diary. As with all these systems, this is our first initial look, as I always say. We're going to get a lot more information about these in the future. And then we go on to regular regiments. This is later in the game that you're going to be having the bulk of your army created as. Your regular army consists of regiments that you do not want to disband and that will require manpower to recruit. This recruitment cannot be done everywhere though, as you need special buildings to allow recruitment of military units. Usually these are the same types of building that will also provide you with manpower. As the ages go by, you go from only having some special buildings provide a minuscule amount of manpower to being able to build conscription centers in your core culture locations. So as we did see, I think it was in the second or third dev diary, they did say at the very beginning of the game, you will have some regiments, but they'll be extremely small, and this backs that up. And then, as they say, as you progress through the ages, you're going to get more and more of your army built up as these regiments that are professionally trained, as much as they are in some situations. And then that's going to be the bulk of your army, and the levy side of thing kind of goes away. And as you can see here, this only applies to areas that you've built the buildings required. So again, you can avoid those areas where you have like big farmlands, maybe big mining situations, things like that. You just don't build these military buildings there, and then they're not going to be drawn from that base power to fund your army in a way with that population and things. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see exactly how this works, the kind of change as the game progresses, rather than in EU4, where it was pretty standard from when you started to when you ended. The units upgraded, but the system worked pretty much exactly the same all the way through. This is going to be that kind of like historical change that happened, and exactly how that plays out is going to be fun to do. And then the next thing they were going to cover is manpower. Manpower in Project Caesar is primarily generated by buildings. Now you may ask, why do we need manpower when you have populations? Well, for that, manpower represents more or less semi-trained men that can be used in a military force. And what is important, however, is that whenever a regiment loses strength, be it through attrition or combat, you will lose population as well. So it is kind of a subsection of population. So when you have your levies, they are drawn directly from your population when you raise them. Manpower, think of it as a, like I say, like a subsection. So you have like 1,000 population, and then you could have 100 manpower. And that 100 manpower, I believe, if I understand this correctly, is basically like you have 1,000 population of normal people, and then you have 100 troops that are kind of trained regiments. But then obviously if like 50 of those 100 die, it will try pull 50 from your base population to fill that bar up again to 100. So I think that's what it's saying here about how you've still got to think they are separate, but it is going to affect your population because it is going to draw people from your population to replenish your regiments as you kind of carry on through your campaign. So you have got to think of it that way, I believe. Let me know in the comments if I've got that incorrect, but I do believe that is what it's talking about. In our next screenshot, we're getting shown a building type. This is a Kuraltai. I apologize if I butchered that pronunciation. I probably did. And this shows, I think, that it needs 5,000 population to support it. It gives the following benefits: 50 manpower per month, and then you can recruit regiments here. And the required production methods for this is leather, cloth. I think the third one is paper, potentially. I'm not 100% sure. And the fourth one is weaponry. And these are the production methods, as they talked about last week, I think it was, where you need these to make them be working effectively as a fighting force. So if you are missing some of these, that affects how good these units are. But then the requirements for construction of the actual building itself is leather, stone, lumber, and weaponry. And that is what you need to build it. And then obviously to upgrade it, you probably need similar things as well. And this is a unique building to the Mongol steppe hordes, so tying into the horse archers before. And nothing too crazy there, just showing you, as they just mentioned, that the manpower and being able to raise regiments are linked to the buildings in certain areas. One other aspect to take into account when it comes to manpower is that in EU5 there are no force limits, but instead you are limited by how many regiments you can maintain. So there's no like, you know, you can only have 8,000 troops. You can never go above that as just like a abstract number at the top of your screen. Every regiment requires some manpower each month to maintain the current level of troops. So that is where you're going to need these buildings to have manpower, where you're going to need manpower to kind of hire and get them into your army. But then you also need some manpower each month to keep them active and keep them fighting as a good force. These units also need a fair amount of goods each month, and if it doesn't have access to them, morale will drop, and it will also not be able to reinforce or maintain its current strength. So you're going to need manpower to keep them fully active, but then you're also going to need these production methods to make sure they're fully stocked up and that their morale is full. So I guess, again, this is kind of a better kind of in-game kind of logical system rather than in EU4 where you just had that slider basically of like, I want to not pay my army full, or I do want to. That might still be in here. I'm not 100% sure if it's been covered already. I don't believe so. We've already had quite a few of these. I don't remember them all off the top of my head when I go off on these side tangents. You have that in EU4 where you have that bar where you just put it down to 0 when you're not at war, and then you max it up as soon as you think you are going to go to war. So we might still have that, but then also on top of that, it is requiring you to have the manpower to keep them active, and then also the production methods to keep them supplied and kind of ready for war as well. So it's not just that one way that affects morale now. You're going to have pretty much like 3 different systems that you've got to keep track of to make sure your army is ready to fight. And again, tied with the earlier changes as well about levies, it's going to make warfare, I think, a lot more interesting in EU5. It's not just raise your armies, do total war, and then just win the war, hopefully. It looks like, especially when you have the levies, you're going to have to really be careful about how many troops you fight in each battle because they can't replenish. And then even these regiments, you're going to have to make sure you've got the manpower to support them, and then also the production methods as well. So it does sound like in EU5, war is going to be a little bit more interesting than in EU4. I mean, EU4, it's not too bad, but EU5, it sounds like it's going to be a little bit more fun. But with all that being said, let's carry on with the dev diary itself. So as you have noticed with some of the screenshots above, units do have a fair bit of unique attributes, and there are some common ones for your entire country. So you have discipline, which impacts damage taken and damage done, military tactics, which impacts the damage taken, army morale, which impacts how long your army is willing to fight, infantry, cavalry, artillery, and auxiliary power, which impacts the damage done for each category. I think all of those make sense. Again, if you played EU4, we've kind of had a system like that in there previously. And speaking of that, there is also army tradition, which is gained primarily from the average experience of your armies, which can be increased by drilling them, which we've all done in EU4, where you just get them kind of standing in the spot, training themselves up, and that increases your army tradition. And this impacts your morale and siege ability of your armies, while also pushing you towards land in the land versus naval societal value. So it does also affect these societal values, which we've covered before in previous dev diaries. We haven't had a lot of information about exactly how these are going to operate in the game, but it sounds like from here that you can kind of push your army to specialize in different areas, because it's saying here if you drill your army, you will move towards being a more land-focused society, I think, whereas if you have that navy, and I guess if you do things with it, maybe you move towards a more seafaring-focused nation. And exactly what that does is going to be interesting. I guess whether it give you special units or give you buffs to those kind of armies or whatever, It's going to be interesting to see. And as he ends here, it does say this is not everything to do with the military. They do need to talk about navies, about logistics, and talk about their combat system that they have planned as well. As always, as I said at the beginning, this is a very brief look at the system, a general overview to get our first look at it. And then I would imagine later on we'll get specific dev diaries about each function of these, or at least kind of larger dev diaries telling us all about it. And as they say here, next week, however, they're onto something completely different and a rather new and unique feature. So initially I thought this was going to be about navies, because it does sound like we're going to get a totally revamped navy system. But with them saying the navy line before, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe it won't be war related at all, but it is going to be a new and unique feature. So, you know, who knows what it is? Put your guesses down below and we can have a discussion and guess what it's going to be. I will say, I will give you heads up, I'm actually away on vacation next week, so I guarantee this is going to be an amazing system that everyone's super happy about. So I will say my dev diary coverage won't be at the usual time next week. I'll actually do it when I get back. So we'll pretty much have no video next week, and then the week after, you'll probably get like 4 videos in the same week, catching up with the dev diary and Johan's replies, and then whatever we talk about in 2 weeks. But as always, we'll leave it there for today. Hit that like button if you've enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new here. I'm covering EU5 up to official announcement, launch, and beyond. And I also cover other historical strategy games as well. But I'll leave it there, and I'll see you in the next one.